Welcome back to Writing Done Right. Well, today we want to talk about reflections on writing memoirs. So we're going to get into the process, why it's a little bit more difficult, and a few other considerations. Welcome back to the channel. I am Tom Murosky, an author and a technology consultant. And on this video, we're going to be talking about writing memoirs, or what I'm doing is testimony, actually. I'm going to talk about the pros and the cons, what I'm doing with that, and some of the reflections, why this is more difficult to write, etc. So here on Writing Done Right, our goal is to teach you how to get your writing done, not only your process of getting your writing done, but also I want to teach you a little bit about the technical how-tos putting your books together into production. And I use free and open source software to do that. So follow along for a variety of different tutorials and let me know the other types of things that you would like to see done. But here we're going to be talking about reflections on memoirs. So I just completed the draft of my book, which is actually more of a testimony than it is memoirs, but it's a very similar process. And sorry, this is one of the reasons why I haven't done quite as many videos here recently, because this thing took a lot more time than I had anticipated it taking. Usually for the last few years, I've been pushing out at least 2 books a year. This year, I pushed out the science fiction novel, Synaptergy, and then I also just wrote this, which it's a little bit longer. It's about, I think it's about 60,000 words, although somewhere between 5 and 10,000 of that is actually poetry. I think probably closer to 5,000. And so it's a fairly average length book for a testimony or a biography type book, but I want to talk about why it was a little bit more difficult. Now, I did a video a few weeks back talking about why I might have made a mistake on one of the processes. So hopefully you can learn from that and evaluate yourself. Did I do the right thing or did I not do the right thing? And honestly, I don't really know. And I'm just going to talk today about my experience here. So we're going to look at 3 principles. Number 1, why writing memoirs, or in my case, a testimony, is a little bit more difficult to write. Second, we're going to look at the process that you can use to write. So what is the type of flow? And number 3, a few different considerations that I have seen and that I have encountered with people in writing groups as I have been working on this particular book. Now, first and foremost, let's talk about the 4 reasons why I think it's more difficult to write a testimony or a memoir. Number 1 is you do need to spend a little bit of extra time digging through your life history. Now, in my case here, this is journals and other pages that I've written, maybe some poetry, stop and reflect on why I wrote that particular poetry, what was going on that led to it. And that really is that first principle, is it takes more time because you have to dig through the journals. This means you're reading a lot of your chicken scratch writing that might have been around since you were in high school, and that was not very neat to look through. Kind of hard to read some of my old high school journals, but I did. I went back through and I reread a lot of my journals. Not all of them, but I did read a lot of them, particularly the early life related materials as I was going through. So that did take a little bit more time, and we'll get into why it's taking a little bit more time down the road in a bit. The second factor is we have to determine what is the most important. This is difficult because we don't just want to throw my entirety of my life story at this and leave it at that. We just don't need to do that. We want to go ahead and figure out what it is I want to say. So I didn't just say, hey, here's just my life story. I wanted to analyze and figure out some points, some lessons we can learn, some things that we want to take. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later here when we get into the process here and the structure. And then closely related to that is number 3 is figuring out what should be left out. This is difficult. Sometimes in our life story, we want to include some of the finer details. Particularly, I had several stories that were excellent, hilarious stories I would have loved to include. They just didn't seem to fit with what I was trying to do. And so I had to spend a lot of time sorting these out, maybe talking to some people that I knew to say, hey, what do you think about this story or that story? And then finally, point number 4, and this will apply to some of you, but maybe not all of you, and that is sometimes you have to dig through your past hurts. We need to dig through our life. Sometimes a compelling story happens when you come from a bad background. And I did not come from a good background. We were poor growing up. I was abused growing up. And the fact is, I had to dig through that. And if you've not done the work required to dig through your past life, you are going to be in for an interesting ride. Now, in my case, I dealt with all that stuff years and years ago. And so it really wasn't problematic. It wasn't like I had to go back through, oh my God, I had to come to grips with all the abuses. No, I didn't have to do that. Although I would have if I did not already experience some of that. But we have to dig through that. We have to understand what our past pains and hurts might be in order to do a better job of evaluating. So those are kind of the 4 reasons I identified why this was more difficult to write. So let's go ahead and talk about the process here. So number 1 is I wrote this with more essays than I usually do. Usually I'll write a single essay on a whole chapter, and it's a fairly short essay, just kind of to summarize the bullet points, and I'll use that to write, and the essay takes, 20, 30 minutes at most to do. Well, these essays I did were much more comprehensive. They were very long. Sometimes I'd spend 2 days on the essay and then another 2 days writing the chapter. And that meant that what I used to be able to accomplish in about 2 or 3 days most, I was actually doing in a whole week. And spreading over several chapters over a whole week, that was a lot. Especially with the format of this, each chapter is significantly shorter than the chapters I have done in the past, but they were still taking about a week to do each of the chapters, and they actually took quite a long time. I think that that's where part of my mistake was. I probably could have gotten away with more bullet points, maybe a few sentences, and then went ahead and write the chapters. In fact, I did that for the last 2 chapters of the book because it was just like getting ridiculous on the time, and I was like, I just need to finish this to move it into the beta draft to start working on the next projects. Like, everyone's been asking for part 2 to Synaptergy, and I haven't gotten to that yet. And the Kings of All Creation needs to be out, and I need to work on that one yet. And I have a few other books in the works as well. And so the essays kind of slowed down the process, although I think that they gave me a better writing product in the end. So time will tell, and maybe the beta readers will tell me if we have a lot less corrections and suggestions to do, because in this book, I did the essays. I read those essays with a friend before actually writing the chapters, and then I would do the chapters. So it actually worked out pretty well. Number 2 is I had a much more detailed outline than I have in the past. Of course, flexibility. Some things did change. I did change around. Actually, I changed the entire format by the time I was writing in the first couple chapters. I was like, okay, I really need to spend a lot more time on a few of these issues. Why? Because I needed to reach and connect with the audience. So I did a much more detailed outline. And in this book here, I wrote it in sections that each of the sections went into short chapters. So the sections themselves aren't terribly long, but they do have a lot of chapters. They're, I don't know, about 1.5, 2 times what I would usually do as a single chapter in a standard nonfiction book that I usually write. And this leads us to part number 3. It is more structured, but I had to come up with a timeline way of doing this. And so there's a few ways you could do it. Number 1 is you could do a pure linear. I think the pure linear, the challenge with doing the pure linear, and the reason I did not do that is because there was several points I wanted to interweave. In my case, I pulled out 5 key points I would like to trace through my life. And while there were several things I left out, I didn't manufacture or create anything out of thin air. I didn't fictionalize any of my story. We'll get into that as my last point with considerations. But what I did is I said, I want to talk about and focus on these 5 principles. And so what I did is I did a linear by topic. So the first section covers birth to elementary school, like I think through elementary school. And then I picked 5 topics, and those 5 topics became the chapter heads, and I did a linear approach through those 5 topics. And then we do a section break, and then I did middle school, and how did those 5 things carry on into the next group of my life in middle school as I carried out. And so these are the things that I did to figure out pure linear wouldn't have worked, but this linear by topic worked really well. The last way you could do it is genuflecting, looking back. Think of it, the book I, Robot is all a series of short essays that were done in a reflective story from, was it Dr. Kelvin, I think, right? She's talking back and telling the story to a narrator as each of these essays is unfolding. That's really how that book is structured if you've ever read it. You could do that and that would actually work fairly well. Most Hollywood movies that are following the childhood of the main character, the main narrator, are set in this format. You know, you have a main narrator and they're speaking back about it. I'm thinking off the top, Radio Flyers 1, you know, Tom Hanks is the grown-up Mikey talking about this one summer that they had. Another one is The War, which isn't future, but it's writing the memoirs of the summer and doing it in sequence from there. These are ways you can do it, and that would actually work very well. So those are kind of a few ways that you can structure a memoir, or in this case, a testimony book. Now, the third thing we want to talk about is considerations, because this is something that did come up a couple times in some of the writing networks I was a part of that I really kind of vetoed pretty quick. There is a trend right now among agents saying, hey, take your story because, ooh, it's complicated, but you may not want to put all this personal stuff out, so fictionalize your story. This is a terrible idea. Well, some agents and maybe some publishers are pushing this. It causes the reader to not connect with the story as much because you never know what is being fictionalized and what is not being fictionalized. And I wanted to avoid that. I wanted to make sure that everything in my testimony, everything in this book that I'm working on is factual. I'm not changing things around. I'm not trying to produce this fictional fun story where I'm tying autobiographical points of my life into it. That's not the intention. And I had numerous people say, hey, you should think about doing that because that's what my agent said to do. I don't care what your agent wants you to do. I'm interested in how this story can reach somebody, and I genuinely think the story can reach somebody best if it's a true and a factual story. And so I went with the factual autobiography rather doing a fictional type approach. And I think that the factual autobiography is infinitely more compelling if it doesn't flow quite as well. I get if I'm manufacturing stuff and just weaving personal stories of my life through it. I completely get I can make the story smoother. Sometimes, though, we have to recognize life is not always smooth. And that's really the reason why I took the approach that I took. So there we have it. There are my reflections on writing memoirs. In my case, it's a testimony book. And I will have more information on all my different channels about this particular book coming out soon. Right now, we are just starting the beta read of it, so I'm hoping that by early March is probably when we're targeting to get it out, but we'll kind of see what happens with the flow of the books that we have. So thanks for coming along on this video. Have a look at the website at WritingDoneRight.net for more information, and I hope that we have helped you to get your writing done.